from Kansas State University. This is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today, K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz on in-furrow starter fertilizer applications for winter wheat. He'll look at the advantages of placing a starter in closer proximity to that seed, taking the necessary precautions, he adds, with those application rates. Then we've more comments from that United Nations International Forum on Sustainable Livestock, taking place this week on the K-State campus. We'll have excerpts from a panel discussion on the role of scientific innovation in sustainable livestock systems. And further ahead, this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Jared Hoyle continues his discussion on seeding a fescue lawn this fall. All right here on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. This is the K-State Radio Network, and we're glad to have you aboard again for another Agriculture Today. Winter wheat seeding will be taking place, depending on where you are geographically in the state, over the next several weeks. We'll focus on this segment on providing proper nutrient to that new wheat stand at the get-go. As we brought by again, nutrient management specialist Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, K-State Research and Extension, on starter fertilizers for wheat or pre-plant, if you prefer that fertilization approach. But Dorivar nutrient management is absolutely pivotal to getting that new stand out of the chute in good shape, right?
Yes, Eric, and specifically talking about starter fertilizer, which is basically, again, focusing on the placement is a key component here, and the timing. We're putting that fertilizer at planting time, and in this case, we're doing an in-furrow with the seed. Of course, it's right there, available to the seed, and that's very important for a crop like winter wheat because we do need to have that nutrient close to the root system in the fall. Typically, we don't have a lot of root development during the fall and winter months. And again, having that nutrient close can make a big difference in terms of establishment, early establishment in the fall, tillering. And this is something that can be done fairly easily with the drill. Air seeders, we do have the possibility of putting, especially dry fertilizers, will be fairly easy to apply with the seed. In many cases, we can even mix the seed with the fertilizer and put it in the drill and apply it that way. So a few benefits there, of course, again, is that placement, having that fertilizer there. But, of course, there are a few factors that we have to keep in mind. And if we are talking about row crops, in-furrow fertilizer can have a little bit more limitation in terms of potential damage to the seedling, and germination, and so on. So we have to be really careful there. In the case of winter wheat, we do have a little bit more flexibility. Obviously, the row spacing is more narrow. So we have the potential of putting higher rates. And actually, in many cases, we may be able to put the full rate of phosphorus fertilizer in furrow, in this case, which is actually a good management approach. And I know many producers prefer to do this, put a little bit higher rates of fertilizer in furrow with the wheat, and basically intended for the next crop coming in the rotation. So we're really putting higher rates that are needed for that specific wheat crop, and again, can be there for the next crop.
Does one, though, have to be careful if they are going to go with this in-furrow approach to applications, making sure that nitrogen isn't in direct contact with the seed?
Yes, and that's really what we need to be looking at and watching very closely here. The question often is how much fertilizer we can apply and still be safe. And the key factor that we have to keep an eye on here is the nitrogen component. Typically, when we talk about potential damage to the seedling, the issue is with the salt content of the fertilizer. And typically, the salt is going to come primarily from nitrogen or potassium. And if we are talking about, more most wheat acres, western Kansas, obviously potassium is not something that we worry about much because we do have plenty of potassium in the soil. But we are really watching that nitrogen component very closely. So if we're using nitrogen phosphorus sources like MAP or DAP, MESC, 40 Rock, that type of sources, then again we need to watch that nitrogen component very closely and make sure we're not putting very high rates. General guidelines usually for a 7.5-inch row spacing, we try to stay below 30 pounds of nitrogen. So that's a number that we need to watch very closely. Those farmers using 10-inch row spacing, we can go up to 24, 25 pounds of nitrogen. Now, again, in this case, we're only watching that nitrogen component. So the phosphorus, of course, is not contributing to that salt component, so it's not really an issue. The phosphorus by itself is not really causing any problems in terms of salt damage and potential in germination.
Now, you mentioned that another option before the producer would be to actually blend certain fertilizer analyses directly with the seed in the hopper for application. There are some ground rules to follow here if one is going that way, you say?
Yes, and this is something that I know some producers do it, and usually, again, some of the concern there is that we are mixing that fertilizer in the hopper, and so we are leaving, in many cases, we may be leaving that overnight or even a few days in cases where we have a rain or we're not able to get to the field. And so the question is, will that affect the germination of the seed? We do actually have an ongoing study where we have data on that, and we evaluated different rates of fertilizer mixed with the seed, and we basically let it sit there for multiple days, all the way from 0 to 2 weeks. And the data that we have shows that as long as the relative humidity is not very high, typically there's no negative effect on germination. In other words, we are able to do that, and if we have to leave that blend of seed and fertilizer sitting in the hopper for a few days is not going to cause any problems. Obviously, we want to try and avoid leaving it there for too long, because if we do have high relative humidity, especially if we get into level of 70% or so or higher, then we're going to have some issues with physical properties of that blend, and that will be a problem. So yes, we do have some flexibility there in terms of doing that blend. We don't see any negative effect on germination, and of course we are getting the benefit of that fertilizer in terms of yield potential, especially in low testing soils.
Now, if folks are inclined, they can still go with pre-plant applications of N and of phosphorus, and there are certain rules to follow there as well, right?
Yes, and of course in that case, if we're doing pre-plant, either broadcast incorporated or just simply broadcast on the surface in the case of no-till management, in that case, of course, we do have more flexibility. Essentially, we don't have to worry about the potential for salt damage. We can do higher rates of application. We can apply even urea without any problems. And in that case, we really need to be focusing in terms of looking at the soil test and what are the total needs in terms of rates for P2O5 in that particular situation. We see similar response in broadcast application incorporated versus in-furrow, depending on the soil test. But there is a key component here that we need to keep in mind is that if we are doing optimum planting dates and conditions are ideal, again, there's usually not a big difference there. But if we are starting to have issues of late planting and we don't have tough conditions like last year, the placement of that fertilizer certainly make a difference. And we can see more response, especially in early growth and establishment with in-furrow application compared to broadcast application. Again, if we have those difficult conditions of excessive moisture, late planting, and so on. So again, all of this basically goes back to application rates, what are the needs. If we are primarily applying phosphorus, we do have a lot of flexibility. Just to put a little bit in perspective, if we are applying, for example, 1152O, a very common source of phosphorus, and if we are trying to put about 40 pounds of P2O5, that will basically supply about 9 pounds of nitrogen. So it's not a lot of nitrogen. And as we described earlier, we can go up to even 30 pounds of nitrogen application in furrow in this case. Now, I want to emphasize in this case, we are not talking about urea. Urea fertilizer is different because we do have the potential for ammonia toxicity from urea. So we're really just looking at that nitrogen from that MAP or DAP fertilizer that we are using.
Once again, though, put the pencil to your best investments as far as your fertilizer products, but there is some flexibility here in how you can go about this, and particularly with the consideration of the in-furrow application. Don't overlook that. And before we let you go on this topic, Dorivar, we focus so much on nitrogen and phosphorus in getting wheat off to that good start. What about micronutrients? There's been occasion to talk about sulfur deficiencies recently.
Yes.
Is that something to think about here?
Yes, that's a very good point. And again, when we talk about phosphorus, we typically have to make that decision based on soil tests. Nitrogen, we don't need a lot of nitrogen early in the season. Obviously, we don't have a lot of growth. So typically, I like to have ideally 20 to 30 pounds of nitrogen. In most cases, tend to be enough, at least for that fall and winter months. And then obviously coming back with that top dress application. But other nutrients, specifically sulfur, is something that we see more and more deficiencies. And we do have a few options in that case. We do have some fertilizer nowadays that are already bringing sulfur in the mix. And again, if we're putting phosphorus and nitrogen, maybe we're already applying some of that sulfur that is needed for that crop. So pre-plant is a good time to be thinking about that. And applications can be done broadcast pre-plant, can be done in furrow, especially if we're using some of these fertilizer products already bringing sulfur. We also do have the possibility of applying later in the season as a top dress application if we are doing more liquid application. And so far we've been discussing mostly dry fertilizer, but liquid fertilizer, of course, will provide the same type of benefits. And if we're thinking about things like sulfur and other micronutrients, liquid fertilizer could provide a little bit more flexibility as we can mix some sources of sulfur and other micronutrients if needed for that particular field. So yes, it is something that we need to keep an eye on. I think we see more and more deficiencies, but again, we need to make sure and we need it. And so soil testing is the step that we need to keep in mind because we don't need it maybe for all the fields. And of course, with tight budgets and so on, we have to make sure and we are investing those dollars where we're going to get the most return.
Very well. And there is an article that covers a great deal of what we've talked about with Dorivar today in a recent Agronomy E-Update newsletter. This was posted on Friday, August the 30th, In-furrow starter fertilizers for wheat. Agronomy.ksu.edu is where you'll find that newsletter. Dorivar, thank you for coming over and sharing all of this.
Thank you.
He's a crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension, Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz. This is Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. And once more, we're sharing with you this week just a mere few of the remarks and the exchanges of ideas that have been taking place this week during that United Nations Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock International meeting here on the K-State campus. Again, upwards of 300 scientists from 22 countries checked in to discuss a broad spectrum of topics relating to livestock production sustainability. This program's been extremely far-reaching in its scope, so we can hardly do justice to it in the broadcast time that we have, but we are highlighting a few examples for you. Tuesday morning, a panel session was conducted on the role of scientific innovation in sustainable livestock systems. 5 panel members were asked to respond to 5 questions under that banner. We've selected one question, and you'll hear the panel responses. That panel included a professor of farm and agribusiness management out of Massey University in Australia, Nichola Shadbold, From the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Deputy Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics, Scott Hutchins, the Director of Agricultural Development in the Global Development Division of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Nick Austin, also a livestock well-being technical consultant for Elanco Animal Health, Michelle Calvo-Lorenzo, and the Vice Minister of Livestock Production for the country of Ecuador, Eddie Pesantez. Now, the question to this group, how will scientific innovation influence the ability of the global livestock sector to respond to climate change? In order of response, Nichola Shadbold of Massey University, who right out the chute called for a tempering of the rhetoric about livestock impacts on climate change.
One of the areas that concerns me when we get to livestock is this absolute obsession we've got at the moment with the greenhouse gases. And the reason I do get concerned is that when I go back to the Paris Accord, it talks about anthropomorphic activity. Now, animals have been belching since they learnt how to convert grass into meat and milk for us, and that's not an anthropomorphic activity. It's just something that I think we just get carried away a little bit with the rhetoric. But moving forward, I mean, we do need animal protein in our diet. Animals will be a part of our world moving as we evolve, always have been, and so we've just got to learn how we balance these things out. The onus is on us now to prove the outcome of what we do in every sense. And so the world hasn't got simpler, it's got a lot more complex. And that's where the data will really help. In terms of the people side of sustainability, I think the whole sort of disruptive innovation can only make life better, robotics, all those sorts of things, better decisions, better informed communities, better informed consumers. But the challenge is data overload, making sure that you can actually work through all this complexity and make those decisions.
Nichola Shadbold of Massey University, Australia. Then Scott Hutchins of the USDA, who pointed to the opportunities for great advances in livestock health and productivity by way of technological innovation.
What we have now is the opportunity with both genetics as well as digital ag is to reduce that complexity. So instead of just saying, it's easier just to do more of this and deal with it at the end than it is to actually precisely apply or whatever the particular input would be, I think those opportunities are going to explode in terms of usability. The other thing I think that we'll be able to do, I think, is really begin to leverage a lot of the human nutrition aspects on things. Just as there's a big effort now to define, if you will, chronic disease endpoints for foods and human diets, I think the opportunity to do those kinds of things for animals is going to be a natural spin-off of that overall effort. And the supercomputing, the ability to do the the genome and everything of animals and plants, for virtually no cost anymore, is going to offer all kinds of opportunities for us to really change the game and think big. But we have to do that. We have to think big, and we have to understand how that fits. And then I would also go back to what I'll call the non-scientific innovations and talk about something like this, because at the end of the day, we need regulatory to ensure that we meet, the minimum standards, that we don't cross the red line, as it were, in whatever that is. But at the end of the day, the consumer decides, and that's the much bigger opportunity I think we have to move the dial is to make sure that the consumer has good education and they have the opportunity. We value greatly in this country the value to choose. And so when you regulate things, you take away the value to choose beyond the necessary aspects of it. But startups and opportunities to customize this give people back that power. And those are the kind of things that will allow us to move the dial, or will allow society to move the dial over time, while allowing those segments that actually don't have that affluency and the opportunity to make those same kinds of choices to meet their nutrition needs. We have the opportunity for others to make that as well. And then we'll have all kinds of positive externalities associated with climate and everything associated with that.
Scott Hutchins of the USDA. Next up was Nick Austin of the Gates Foundation, who concurred with Nichola Shadbold on the thought of redirecting the focus of the relationship between livestock production and climate change.
I'd stay with Nicola's theme around perspective when it comes to greenhouse gas emissions versus adapting to a changing climate. And we know with the the commitments and the money invested globally in responding to climate change, it's disproportionately into mitigation, not adaptation. And when we look at smallholders, the impact of a changing climate is going to be felt most keenly with pastoralists, with smallholders who are already farming and producing livestock in some of the most challenging agroecologies. So we look at the Sahel and we know that projections of both higher temperatures but more extreme events and the consequences that has for eroding the natural resource base and further disadvantaging. And it's the sequence of bad years that we know pushes people back into poverty and undermines a lot of the progress. So if we're looking at climate change eroding 5 to 20% of productivity in agriculture by 2050, then all of the good work in innovation that we've been talking about comes to naught when it's undermined. So I think that's a really important piece. I think, so how do we adapt? How do we get better epidemiology, how we surveillance of pests and disease, which are going to change the vectors of animal disease, we're going to change under a changing climate. How do we get more resilient tropical adapted breeds? And so the important role that the national governments, state governments play. But I just conclude with the role that private sector plays, which perhaps needs particular emphasis in relation to climate change. The Foundation's interests in understanding where's the market not working and what can we do with philanthropic capital to change that equation so that there is a business case, there are business models where the private sector can deliver at scale the sort of technologies that farmers need to respond to a changing climate.
Nick Austin of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Then Michelle Calvo-Lorenzo of Elanco weighed in, and her focus, not surprisingly, was on advancing animal health on a global scale in the wake of climate change.
When we think about animal health, the OIE, or the World Organization for Animal Health, has reported that 20% of animals die globally, right, due to stressors and disease, right? And that's a huge amount of waste, right? That otherwise all the resources that went into those animals, right, and they never met that endpoint to nourish us or to help us sustain our livelihoods, right? And so I think that in itself, if we focus in on that and focus in on reducing that number, that can significantly improve, again, those conversations and the tools how they're utilized to, again, achieve that sustainability. And so I think that in order to reduce that number, we need, again, these innovations that help us improve how we care and handle for all of the animals. And innovations that help focus on reducing that 20% globally can be very, very impactful from that conversation of sustainability, even relative to climate change.
Michelle Calvo-Lorenzo of Elanco Animal Health. Lastly, comments from Eddie Pesantez of Ecuador. Speaking through an interpreter, he called on livestock production scientists and producers to do more to help the world understand that the livestock sector is tuned into the climate change issue and is responding.
We in the livestock industry have not been able to communicate our efforts well to our population because sometimes we're perceived like some people that don't care about the environment. And one of the main objectives of this type of meeting should be to set a clear message for us to be able to spread out. And we have to show our best practices to the world so that people can understand what is that we do.
Y volvemos a las preguntas anteriores.
And we have social media, and we have great scientists, we have professors, we have everybody. We have people who are very knowledgeable about our industry. But we have to portray our industry, and we have to show the world so the perception about our industry shouldn't be the one that we have. So we have to spread the word.
Via interpreter, Eddie Pesantez, Vice Minister of Livestock Production in Ecuador. That's just a sampling of comments made by the panel during a session on the role of innovation in sustainable livestock systems during that UN Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock Conference this week on the Kansas State University campus. Tomorrow, comments from a similar panel discussion on the role of trade on sustainable livestock systems. This is Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Now in our 95th year of broadcast service to Kansas agriculture, this is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Over now to today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin told the Senate Banking Committee this week that deputy-level trade talks between the U.S. and China this month will have a focus on agriculture. Mnuchin assured lawmakers that they have spent a lot of time even on trying to get an interim agreement on agricultural issues with China. He said, quoting here, "We want to make sure that China treats our farmers fairly and does not retaliate against the farmers in an unfair way," in his words. As for those talks later this month at the deputy level, Mnuchin said that he could tell that agriculture is at the top of the agenda for the conversations that will be had. Mnuchin also referred to China's commitments to buy U.S. agricultural goods that have not been met with actual purchases. Meantime, yesterday, China announced it will exempt some American imports from tariff hikes, but did keep in place penalties on soybeans and other U.S. exports ahead of negotiations next month. This move applies to raw materials for Chinese farmers and factories, suggesting that Beijing wants to limit the damage to its slowing economy from this fight over trade and technology with the U.S. A list of 16 items, including lubricants, fish meal for animal feed, and some other chemicals, will be exempt from penalties of up to 25%. The punitive damages duties, that is, on soybeans, though, were left unchanged. Will that new round of USDA crop forecasts coming out within the hour now cause as big a stir as last month's report? We will soon know as we hear from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
After last month's huge corn acreage and production estimates that shocked markets, what's in store this time?
Just like everyone, we don't know what to expect.
Mark Jekanowski is acting chairman of USDA's Outlook Board. He says this month, the USDA Statistics Service will be doing its first of the season actual measurements of crops on thousands of plots of land that could give some clues on crop yields. But with crop development for corn and beans so behind normal, those clues may be very tentative. Jekanowski's group will be issuing new demand and price projections. That's very difficult. For the last couple of weeks for corn, for an example.
The market has been keying in their expectations for improved yields because of weather, and then yesterday's crop progress report deflated that outlook a little bit.
And inflated price prospects with an unexpected 3% drop in the amount of corn reported in good to excellent shape, demonstrating yet again.
There's been a ton of volatility this year, maybe more than most.
Making things very hard to project. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Washington.
The 2019 Kansas Junior Livestock Show gets going next week. Sam Capone breaks down the livestock numbers and what counties are sending the most entries.
Exhibitors have entered 1,906 head of livestock, which includes 134 market steers, 333 breeding heifers, 230 market hogs, 271 breeding gilts, 275 market lambs, 288 breeding ewes, 197 market goats, and 178 commercial doe kids. This statewide event will be held September 27th through 29th at the Kansas State Fairgrounds in Hutchinson. For the sixth consecutive year, Douglas County leads the state with the most exhibitors and the largest number of total livestock entries. Youth from Douglas County also have entered the most market lambs. The breeding gilts category is led by Dickinson County. Finney County has the most market hog entries and is tied with Butler County for the most market steers entered. The largest number of heifers was entered by Pottawatomie County. Miami County competitors have entered the most market goats. The largest number of breeding ewes was entered by Leavenworth County. Elk County has the most commercial doe kid entries. The show will award cash to exhibitors of the top 5 animals in both market and breeding shows for all 4 species. A showmanship contest also will be held. The top showman in the junior, intermediate, and senior divisions of each species will receive a silver belt buckle. Prizes also will be awarded for 2nd through 5th place in each division. In addition, KJLS will present several scholarships during the show to exhibitors who have excelled academically in community service and 4-H/FFA. This is the 27th year for the scholarship program, which has awarded a total of $450,900 to 323 exhibitors since 1993. KJLS will again offer the Lead Challenge, which is an educational and advocacy event that provides an opportunity for exhibitors to learn about current industry issues and apply that information in a competitive environment. The Mid-America Classic Collegiate Livestock Judging Contest will be held in conjunction with the show as well. I'm Sam Capone.
Now the Kansas soybean update with Greg Akagi. Greg?
Bob Hazelwood from Barrington joins us. He's also a Kansas soybean commissioner. And Bob, you recently returned from a trip to Japan that was led by the U.S. Meat Export Federation. What was the purpose of the trip?
Well, the main purpose of the trip was to help promote U.S. pork and beef into the Japan market.
And it's important that the soybean industry maintain a strong partnership with the U.S. beef and pork industry.
The Kansas Soybean Commission partners with U.S. Meat Export Federation on some projects to help promote U.S. pork in Japan. And as we all know, U.S. pork consumes a lot of soybeans in their feed rations, and that is just one way that we can get more use of our soybeans.
And this is on top of what potentially is coming down the line of a bilateral trade agreement between the United States and Japan.
Yes, which we hope is going to be good news where the tariffs Japan has on U.S. pork and beef. They're hoping to get them to equal playing percentages compared to the other countries that they import beef from.
Bob, has the U.S. maintained a good relationship with Japan with regards to the importing of U.S. soybeans into their country?
Yes, we're still we're their primary supplier for soybeans. Japan is a more mature market and has been a long-term customer. They don't have the facilities or the capacity to produce as much meat as their population is consuming, so that's why we work with the U.S. MEF.
To find those customers and define those areas in Japan that are in need of that, not only for what you provide for U.S. pork and beef, but what could go into Japan, too.
Yes, all the pork that's in the grocery store or retail level, it's labeled whether it is U.S. pork or probably labeled that it's U.S. pork alongside with the locally raised pork. And then also the U.S. beef is probably labeled as such. The U.S. beef kind of sits into a market that is above the Australian grass-fed and below the Japan-raised Wagyu beef. So there's a real good place for it to fit in there.
You had talked about it being a robust market, but with the potential down the road of that bilateral trade agreement, it's got to excite the industry, beef side, pork side, soybean side, and other sides too.
Yes, I think there's a growing demand for U.S. pork and beef. The consumer there likes the product, and if we could get the tariffs agreement straightened out, I think that this will put U.S. pork and beef at a more competitive level to everything else in their marketplace.
Bob, we appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg.
That's Bob Hazelwood from Barrington, who is a Kansas soybean commissioner, and he joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
And this is Agriculture Today.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today, and capping off this edition, our weekly horticulture segment. And this time continuing our conversation started last week with K-State turfgrass specialist Jared Hoyle. As now, Jared, we are into the fall lawn seeding season. For those intending to seed or overseed a cool season lawn, fescue the primary example there. Last time we concentrated on getting that seed into the ground. This time, more on input management. Fertilization has to be part of this, does it not?
That is correct. So if you're seeding, right after you get done broadcasting seed, you could broadcast your fertilizer. We like to look at if it's a new lawn, new establishment, instead of going with our typical 1 pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet on an existing lawn, cut it in half to about a half a pound, but you might have to feed it a little more. We don't want that new grass seed to grow too fast and not put on roots. Also, with a new lawn, or if you are overseeding an existing lawn, you might want to make sure that that fertilizer has some phosphorus in it, which is the second number in the bag. That really aids in the root development of those new seedlings. Typically, our lawns in Kansas have enough phosphorus in it, or our soils do, but that is spread out over a 4 to 6 inch depth. And if we apply phosphorus, it stays right there on the surface because it's an immobile element, and so it's taken immediately up by that newly germinated plant. If you are overseeding an existing lawn, you can go with the 1 pound per 1,000 square feet, or you can do the half a pound of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet, whatever your preference is, because you are going to have existing turf in there and newly seeded turf. I lean more on the edge of a half a pound and do the more frequent spoon feeding every so often. And once that turf gets established, then you just go right back into your regular maintenance tall fescue fertility program.
And that fertilizer product has to be watered in, does it not?
Yes. So as soon as you get done with your seeding and as soon as you get done with your fertilizing, then you want to start watering. A good, thorough watering at the beginning to make sure we don't want to wash anything out and get that soil profile filled up. And then we do light, frequent watering to keep that seed bed moist. And then once it starts germinating, we switch to that more deep and infrequent type watering. If you don't have irrigation, or if you're not going to irrigate, then try and plant it around a rainstorm. Maybe not a gully washer, but the best we can do in that time. But yes, getting that product watered in will really help it. It'll help get it kick-started. If it doesn't get watered in immediately, it'll be okay. If it's a day or two, that's perfectly fine as well. But just know every day that you wait, it's just a day later that it's going to be to germinating as well.
And is there any need, Jared, for weed control upon establishing this lawn?
There's always a need for weed control. Weeds are one of the most problematic plants in a lawn. There are some options out there. I recommend, and as a general rule, to wait a couple weeks after it gets established. If you do have some weeds come up, then look at the products for control of those weeds specifically and just pay attention to those labels of how long you need to wait after you've seeded or after you've seen germination. Most of the time it's a couple mowings or 3 or 4 weeks and it's safe on it. And there's some of the newer products out there that have the window is shorter, so you can get out there sooner than later to clean up those weeds as you're seeding your new lawn.
But does one typically worry more about broadleaf weed invasion or grassy weeds?
More at this time of the year, we're going to see more broadleaf weeds just because more of those are going to be a perennial weed, so they're either already there or they're going to start coming up and being more healthy at this time. We don't see as many summer annual weeds like the crabgrass or the foxtails just because they're starting to get towards the end of their life cycle. So their germination is not going to be as high, but doesn't mean they won't be there. So really more towards those broadleaf applications. And hopefully before you do this, you can get out there and also you can, if you're overseeding your lawn, you can go ahead and pre-treat those weeds, wait the appropriate amount of time according to the label, and then start your overseeding process. If you're establishing a new lawn, if you've killed all the vegetation there, hopefully they won't come back, but there may be 1 or 2 problematic weeds if you've had them in the past that you may want to go out and take care of afterwards.
All right. Well, let's say that one has gone through all the steps, has successfully established a good, healthy new stand or an overseeded stand of fescue. That first mowing of the fall, and it should be in the fall, is fairly important too, you say.
After seeding, yes. We don't want the turf to get too tall and then cut too much off of it. If you stick to the regular turf 1/3 rule, then you will be perfectly fine. Even though they're small, tender plants, they can withstand the mowing. The turf likes to be mowed. It's used to being the foliage being removed. So as soon as it gets to the height that it needs to be for you to cut it back, go ahead and remove those leaves earlier than later.
Important caveat there when mowing, and this is a little down the road, but maybe not that far. Be careful about not operating that mower on overly wet soils, causing issues.
Yes, overly wet soils is, I always like to wait till it dries out in the afternoon. With new lawns and existing lawns, if you mow when it's wet, the clippings can get clumpy, so dispersing those clippings are best. If you mow on a wet soil and you have a heavy piece of equipment or your traffic, then you can actually lead to compaction when the soil is wet. So sometimes it's better to wait, let the soil dry out. Sometimes we don't have any control over it, so do the best you can.
Very well. Well, all of this, and in much more detail, is outlined in a publication from K-State Research and Extension on planting a home lawn, and that's easily accessed, Jared.
Yes, that is correct. You can get all horticulture publications at the Kansas State Research and Extension bookstore through the website, and there's a lawn and garden section that covers a lot of different aspects of the lawn, but there is one out there called Planting a Home Lawn that outlines from start to finish of what you need to do.
Well, it traditionally is a great project for homeowners in the increasing cool of late summer into early fall, and that is establishing or shoring up that fescue lawn out there. So get after it very soon, homeowners. And thanks for the tips, as always, Jared.
Thank you.
Jared Hoyle is a turfgrass horticulturist with K-State Research and Extension. Again, you can find that fact sheet on planting a home lawn at the KSRE bookstore online, or go to the K-State Horticulture website where you can access that information likewise. That is this week's Horticulture segment. And that is our time for today. Thanks to you for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.